Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about how clubs measure risk. Now, the first part of the talk is going to be focusing on traditional manned vessels, but we're also going to touch upon some of the considerations that we at the club have and some of the thoughts we have about unmanned vessels and what changes that may pose to the risks that owners and operators of vessels may face. So for those who aren't familiar with the P&I sector specifically, there's an international group of P&I clubs. These are 13 mutual associations providing insurance cover at cost, and they're wholly owned by the members who are the policy holders of the clubs. All of the clubs offer a standard P&I cover, a standard level of cover. This is the rule book that the Shipowners Club has. It's quite a lengthy document because it's a very mature form of cover in the marine market. Each one of the 13 clubs will have something pretty much exactly the same as this, but perhaps with a different photo on the front. The reason that we all offer exactly the same cover is it enables the clubs to pool their risks. So clubs pool large claims amongst themselves, and they also purchase collectively. The international group of clubs purchases reinsurance cover here in London. Our host Millers have been helping the IG with that for a very long time. And this collective purchase of reinsurance enables the clubs to provide a very high limit of cover for their members. For those who aren't so familiar with the Shipowners Club, we're well known as being the club for smaller and regionally trading vessels. We also enter lots of specialist vessels, and the kind of ships that we cover will be cargo ships, perhaps trading regionally up and down the coast or on inland waterways. We cover lots of passenger ships, so these could be ferries. We also have a lot of yachts entered, albeit most of those are on a private basis. We insure a large part of the offshore industry, so these will be the kind of supply vessels going out to offshore rigs, crew boats, anchor handlers, that kind of thing. We have lots of tugs and barges entered, many of which operate up and down inland waterways. We have lots of fishing vessels entered. And my favourite category is the specialist vessels that we insure. So we insure vessels that are involved in the construction industry, such as pile drivers, dredgers, IT-related vessels such as cable layers, that kind of thing. So that was a quick introduction to P&I. Moving on now to how clubs measure risk. So I'm talking principally, first of all, about traditional manned vessels. One of the main variables that the clubs look at when it comes to vessels will be vessel size. There are a number of reasons for this. Most of it's fairly common sense, but I'm just going to run through it with you. So risk typically increases from an underwriting perspective with size due to the following factors. First of all, the number of crew at risk. Now, we've all heard this morning in the talks, I think James made the point particularly clearly that autonomous doesn't necessarily mean unmanned, so autonomous vessels may still have crew on board, but we would expect it to be fewer. The number of passengers on board when it comes to passenger ships is another reason that larger ships present a greater risk. Increased cargo capacity. One of the things we also touched upon this morning is that the removal of crew accommodation will mean more space for cargo on board a vessel, so more property at risk. Larger ships typically cause more damage in collisions. Now, anyone who's owned and operated a tug will beg to differ with me on that point, because a lot of rather sturdy tugs can cause considerable damage in a collision. Be that as it may, larger vessels tend to cause more damage. Larger vessels obviously are more expensive to remove in the event that they become a total loss. Now, it's for all these reasons that P&I underwriters tend to think of risk as a rate per gross tonne, obviously reflecting the size of the vessel. The graph on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can make out the axes, probably. So this is based on claims data that the club has collected for offshore supply craft, and what we can see here is that the average cost of claims per year increases with gross tonnage. All different vessel types will have their own curve. That's the one for that particular vessel type, and that helps underwriters reach a premium when rating a risk. Moving on now to think about claims causation. I've heard lots of different statistics used in relation to what is the proximate cause of claims. What everyone seems to be in agreement on is that human error is the main cause in the majority of claims. So looking at our club data, human error accounts for 53% of claims. What sits behind that is quite often factors such as fatigue, lack of a regular pattern of sleep, sometimes difficult sea conditions, and sometimes simply the stresses of trying to reach a sound judgment when there's a risk to life. Now, all of these factors we expect should be diminished or reduced when a vessel's being remotely operated, or if the master of the vessel can avail himself of greater decision assistance, such as we would expect to see with unmanned vessels, autonomous vessels. The next slice of the pie there is personal illness. So that encompasses injury as well as illness, and what we're talking about there is principally crew. So obviously if a vessel's completely crewless, then that part of the risk will disappear altogether. That's not to say crew can't have injuries when they're ashore, but if you're operating from I think the example was a mobile office in Nottingham, it's a much safer environment than being out at the high seas. What I'd like to draw your attention to here is that there is no category on that pie chart in relation to cyber risk. I'm very interested to see what the results will be to our questions in relation to cyber risk later on today, and we've heard some thoughts for and against the arguments as to whether or not cyber risk will increase with autonomous ships. I'm just making the point here, though, that we at the club have not yet seen a great volume of cyber claims. Long may that continue. Looking at claims in a slightly different way now, thinking about claims by type. Britt mentioned earlier that crew claims represents just over 30% of the claims that the club receive. Now, the club has a very strong ethos of corporate social responsibility. A large focus of our loss prevention team's efforts are in reducing crew claims. Obviously, if all of the crew are remotely operating, then they're in a much safer environment, as I mentioned earlier, so we'd expect to see that reduced drastically. And this is something that we really want to support our members in achieving a reduction in lost and injured crew. The next slice of the pie there, representing around about a quarter of it, is navigational claims, so collision and elision. I think it's difficult to say at this stage what's going to happen in terms of risk exposure. We do expect that it should reduce as autonomous ships come to the fore and members embrace technology that gives them better navigational capabilities. Whether it will disappear altogether and the interactions with manned vessels, who knows, we wait to see, but we're very hopeful that should reduce. A small slice of the pie just up at the top there is for pollution. Now, we do experience pollution-related losses in relation to the navigational claims. What that 4% represents there is pure pollution claims. So this might be simple things like an error in refueling a vessel, so spilt bunker fuel. Obviously, if we were one of the other clubs that insures huge tankers, we might see pollution claims representing a greater exposure for us, but nevertheless it's an exposure that we want to see reduced, and we're hopeful that as more and more vessels move towards electric motors rather than diesel engines, that's a head of claim that could reduce because you don't have bunker fuel on board, if nothing else. So I hope that's given you a quick overview of P&I and the Shipowners Club. And an idea about some of the factors that underwriters consider when rating and considering the risk exposures of our owners, and some of the club's ideas about how these exposures may change. We do have an autonomous vehicle policy, as Britt mentioned earlier, and my colleague Camilla's going to talk more about that later. But overall, the club's hopeful that there should be, in embracing the new technology, there should be tangible benefits to the safety of people working in the industry and to the environment. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking to sort of a slightly different audience. I'm often out talking at technical conferences full of engineers and preaching to the converted, and it's really good to meet some people from a sort of different background, insurance, legal, up here in the city. Been involved in unmanned vessels for over 15 years, and we stood up sort of some historic small companies into a group a few of us founded in 2010 called ASV Global. If I'd have been here in 2010 sort of talking to you, I think I'd have been here too early. I think in that sort of time frame, 2010, it was very much research, development, science, proof, early cases. However, the time really is right for you as a city, as an industry, to be getting involved in this space. It's moving fast, and it's moving from that R&D phase into actual growth. We're past just early adopters. We're now into the business time. So looking forward to some questions later. So I was asked to talk about risk and risk analysis in front of a heavy insurance and law audience, and that filled me with fear as an engineer. But here it goes. I'll do my best. I'm going to give you a quick intro to ASV Global, just to set the scene of what I do and what I talk about. We predominantly focus on sub-24 metre vessels that we design and build and supply as a system, and then we put software onto bigger ones. So I'll tell you a bit about what we do. Trends that I've seen in the industry and continue to see. Risk, and I'm going to talk about thinking in 4 dimensions, and risk is one of the dimensions. And then a little bit about opportunities for the UK. It got mentioned earlier, I'm lucky under the Society of Maritime Industries to chair a MAS council, and that's very much about business and how can we all grow UK businesses, UK jobs. So I'm not going to talk much about the thing. We're about 130 people, lots of engineers building these systems. The yellow ones tend to be for oil and gas, hydrography, science. The grey and black ones tend to be for military applications, and we're about half and half. About half of what we do is military, half commercial. Got a few, so we've delivered about over 100 systems, I think it's 104, to about 10 countries around the world. So we do export a lot of this tech, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in the UK to export more and more of this type of tech and systems and services and insurance and advice. So that's enough about us. Here's a very short video. I thought I'd get a video in there to give some of you a feel for what some of these systems look like at the minute. Taking systems out onto the water. This is some of the work we do with last response engines. So when all other sensors have failed, when everything else has gone wrong, when no one's done what they should do, that last response. Lots of different designs of different systems. There's quite a few companies around the world doing this. There's a few here in the UK. This is something the UK is good at and was an early leader in these smaller systems. Integrating lots of third-party sensors. It's been good for the UK sort of marine sensor industry. It's not just about building the platforms and the software, but also all the sensors that go onto them. Lots of companies now using them for charting. There's multiple systems offshore. And it's everything in our industry from fairly small things, maybe 3 meters long that you might use at the top of a harbour, right through to things actually out in the oil and gas industry, which are 16 meters, 18 meters, 24's coming soon. Here you go. This video plays out in a second. But some of these are proven doing thousands of kilometers of operations. These are not just R&D tools. That's the point I wanted to get across. They're out there now. We've delivered about 100. When we do a survey of other sort of competitors and organisations around the world, the total I come up with is about 1,000. There's approximately 1,000 unmanned boats on the water today. They're not necessarily all out every day. Some of them are, but there's about 1,000. So some trends that I've seen is absolutely growth in vessel size. When we were first doing this in 2015, we saw 10 meters as big. In fact, when the US Navy put out its roadmap for unmanned surface vehicles, they called large 11 meters. Now, the US Navy's roadmap is small is 11 meters, large is 150 plus. You know, it's completely shift in size. So a big trend in vessel size and value, and interesting to look back to the graph that we just saw, I guess, making that link. We've seen a move from sort of non-critical operations, you know, some parallel operations, that if there was a delay, it maybe wasn't the end of the world, into things that are absolutely critical. So typically oil and gas industry, when we were first involved, we might have done some pre-site work where, you know, it had to get done, but the timeline was a bit more flexible. Recently, we've been involved in jobs where we're actually involved in laying the pipe, and we're actually a critical part of the system. Likewise with the Navy, in the early days it was maybe some background intelligence type work. Now it's actually clearing mines ahead of a fleet, so it's become critical. We've seen a growth in over-the-horizon operations. Early days of unmanned vehicles, everything was linked to limited by the radio ranges. We used to get 20, 25 miles at max. Now through satellites, effectively anywhere in the world, few challenges at the poles. We've seen a lot more acceptability of, I call it supervised autonomous operations, the point that James and others raised earlier around harmonising of definitions. I cannot wait until that work gets done. Until then, we all say different things. Early days, it used to be you had to be able to see the vessel. The Coast Guard weren't really happy with us going anywhere beyond line of sight. Really not that keen on autonomy at all. They wanted direct teleoperation, man in the loop, remote control. But the trend has certainly seen a growing level of acceptance. And then just growing experience. I think every week, talk about exponential technology, I think we're in exponential experience as well. The number of vessels coming out is increasing. The days on the water, the people involved in using them, there's a lot of experience building up very, very fast. So those are some trends I've seen. And growing business sizes. For a long time, we were stuck as a few guys in a garage. We've grown up to about 130. There's a similar company to us in the States that's getting up towards 200. There's others around the world. There's a lot of jobs being created in this. Right, risk. So, I'm an engineer, not an actuary. So I'm going to talk about risk as I see risk. I asked Wikipedia, actually, first of all, what it thought risk was. And chance or possibility of danger, loss, injury, or other adverse consequences. Now, my first sort of exposure to risk as a junior engineer was in doing risk analysis for the trials I wanted to do and the things I wanted to do in the workshop. So I was very familiar with building, launching, operating, that kind of risk assessment, risk analysis. How can we mitigate those risks? Then as I kind of moved on in my career, I got into business risk. If I spend this and don't get that return, am I going to get in trouble with my shareholders? Kind of got used to business risk. But to me, it was always slightly subjective. It was always a little bit of a I feel, I think, and we'd try and colour things in, red, amber, green, and make these tables of risk. That to me was risk. However, since working with ASV, I've kind of started to see risk as actually quite an engineering parameter, something we can really quantify. And we actually treat it as a fourth dimension. It's an engineering term now in autonomy. So we developed these advanced world models of how the marine robot sees the world. We do path planning and collision avoidance, situational awareness, and that's all based around latitude, longitude, time, that's 3 dimensions, and risk being the 4th dimension. We then build mathematical models of these 4 dimensions from static data, charts, S57s, tidal models, almanacs, and then add on top of that live dynamic data from sensors. We have agents that predict these models into the future. So we look at trend analysis, different types of ships, likelihood of them carrying on certain paths, so on and so forth. We build a model into the future. We modify the risk landscape, the risk distributions around objects so that we can comply with COLREGs. So we can increase the risk in front of a vessel, on the starboard side, on the port side, depending on the situation, scenario. And then we have it sounds very techy, doesn't it? A 4D space search technique that really looks for the safest route, the lowest risk route, what to do next through that model. And we monitor risk exposure as we go as numbers. It's quantifiable, it's graphs, it's data, it's statistics. So it's logged, it's tracked, it's monitored. And then we can actually allow users to set thresholds. So the admiral that's got to clear the beach, got to get the job done, may well set a higher risk appetite than the commercial operator operating in a busy area. So it's something we can learn from and learn with and tune. What does it look like? Here's a polar plot. You have to think like a computer here, not a human. But this is really, we look at polar plots of risk. So we bring in lots of different sensors. We bring in multiple types of radar array, multiple types of camera, day and night. We use AIS. Obviously, you have to treat that all with caution. But the radar and vision lamped together with sometimes LiDAR in some applications, the chart data, the background data, and build these risk models. And as you sort of then work through, the scenarios, what we found is humans are good at tracking things and small numbers of things. They've got this 6th sense. It's very hard to describe how humans do some things, but they do it. But they're really good at maybe tracking 3 or 4 or 5. You might find a superhuman that can do 10 or 20, CPAs at a time in their head of what's going to happen, but there's not many of them. Some submariners are good examples of a few that can. Robots can do hundreds. Robots can look at the activity, the behavior, the risk, the vectors of all of these things 100 times a second. That's nothing to process that. And it really opens up a new way of navigating and understanding risk. Not going to go through this too much, but what we effectively do, when you first give a robot a task at the very beginning, it's quite high risk. You've just said, hey, go out into the North Sea and try and find and inspect that pipe, as an example. There's a lot of risk around that. Through developing the world model, loading in background data, bringing in sensor data, and these fusion and risk models, our goal is to get to a low risk. And that's how robotics is working. That's how most of the architectures in the car world are working, most of the architectures in the air, most of the architectures on convoy trucks, etc. This model is quite familiar. Cyber. Brid asked me to put a slide in about cyber, and I said, uh-oh, how do I answer this one? What do we say? So, a lot of learning going on across the entire industry when it comes to cyber. It doesn't matter whether you're a large defence prime or a very small survey company. Cyber is something you're learning about. There are nobody out there, in my opinion, that's got the perfect answer, the perfect solution, the perfect product, the perfect model. So what we have done as a company is basically work with companies to the same standards that they're running their offices to. So if we're working with a large oil prime, what's your cyber policy? What types of switches, what types of software, what type of ring, perimeter fence do you need, and carry that across into their marine operations. That's how a lot of them have worked historically with some of their ship systems. How do they do it in the office? Let's do the same at sea as a baseline. We do use encryption. That's for sure a certain thing that the tech in that space is moving incredibly fast. Talked earlier about maybe law doesn't quite move as fast as technology. Technology doesn't quite move as fast as some of the hackers and the illegals out there. I'd say the most innovative people are the ones trying to break things. So whatever encryption we have and we think is good, someone out there thinks they can do better. We use proprietary control messages. I think that's a really important point within autonomy. When you look into ones and noughts and things traveling through the air and through space, it's actually quite hard to crack if it's proprietary. If it's using open standards, NMEA or something, it's easy. A lot of concerns over GPS spoofing. Hard to get away from that question at most conferences and most sales pitches. However, as time is moving on, particularly, I'll give you an example in the oil and gas field, we'll quite regularly now use an acoustic underwater system as a backup to surface GPS. So when we're operating near a platform, we'll have transponders on the seabed, and we'll actually get a backup position from the seabed. So there are various sort of ways of getting around that. You can spend an awful lot on GPS antennas that claim to be spoof-proof. And then, this is for debate and discussion, and I think this will come up again later. I think actually there's an opportunity to reduce a lot of risk. I think a lot of the risks around cyber, particularly in the office, does come from people going on the wrong websites, plugging in the wrong USB sticks into the wrong place, adding a little Ethernet expansion switch to the one on their desk that they shouldn't, and things like that. It opens a path for people to get in. If you've got an autonomous system and you've done your systems engineering and you've done it properly, you've approved it and you use it correctly, there's actually fewer ways in. A couple of opportunities just to wrap up. So at the moment, there's an industry going here in the UK that is supplying complete systems with sensors and software to organisations undertaking things like mine countermeasures. The UK, French navies are currently buying systems. There's about 3 other European navies about to do the same. Oil and gas, survey, metocean monitoring, that type of work. Security, hydrography, likes of Bibi here looking at hydrographic systems. That's happening now. That's business as normal. People are making revenues, making profits, employing people. That's a business. But there's an opportunity to move into other types of vessels, other types of operations. Transport, huge one. There's certainly opportunities within the sort of insurance community owners, regulators, to understand their exposures to risk. So some of the software, some of the techniques we've developed in the autonomy AI space could certainly move. There's some quick wins in bringing that into the conventional space, helping quantify these risks, get away from red, amber, green, turn it into data, into numbers we can look at over time. Help operators perform better, this man-machine teaming, this hybrid. It came up earlier about making humans perform better. Some of these tools with the right user interface can really help a man on the bridge, absolutely guaranteed. When a master mariner's fresh, he's wide awake, he's in a high-risk area, he's alert, he's an incredible piece of machinery, he's a fantastic capability. When he's been on shift for a long time, the weather's poor, he's tired, he's just had a call from home that one of his kids is sick, and the human is subject to weaknesses like that. Robots are not. Robots perform very consistently. Could the robot help the human when time is needed? The UK is certainly going to be, being positive about this, a leader in regulation, insurance, classification, consultancy services around this. We're all here now. There's no doubt competition, but I think we're in a fantastic place to stay at the front of this, and it's encouraging to see so many people at events like this. I want to add technology to the list. We do have competition in Norway and Finland and America and France and Singapore, but let's make sure that we're actually building kit here in this country rather than just supplying services. So that's been my drive. Let's build equipment here. So I'm glad you're here. There's a lot of opportunities in this space, and I hope some of you are leaving with business ideas and how you can get in early and really get involved. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
I'm really, really delighted to be here today to speak to you about the club's P&I policy for maritime autonomous vehicles. First of all, I'd just like to pick up on a few themes that have been raised a bit during the day today. It's been really enlightening and encouraging to hear how the industry is going from strength to strength. And Dan and Katrin in particular mentioned their hope that the UK can lead the way in various areas in the sector, including insurance. And it won't be any surprise to you that we absolutely share this hope. And indeed, that growth and strengthening in the industry, as Britt has already mentioned, has led us to seize this opportunity to develop our own P&I insurance policy for autonomous vehicles operating in the small and the specialist market. We believe this is the first P&I policy of this type. And as we're the club known for small and specialist vessels, that seems an absolute perfect fit for us. So we're really, really excited. So my colleague Paul explained a little bit about the IG for those who are not so familiar with its workings. As Paul mentioned, our club rules mirror closely other club rules, and that's because common risks are shared between the international group clubs. Now, our rules are comprehensive. They're about 149 pages long, with all traditional risks accounted for, and they're based on a mature marine insurance market. Now, the international group is really interested in autonomy, and they have set up a working group. The international group has set up a working group to consider the risks associated with autonomy. Brit's our representative for the Shipowners Club on that working group, and I believe they have met, or they're about to, and that work is going on. But the IG is not yet there in terms of confirming that autonomous vessel risk can be pooled by the international group clubs. So the club rules are not going to be currently suitable for autonomous vessel risks. Now, in 2011, as a club, we developed a range of plain language all risk policies, which are specific to particular vessel types within the club. And so currently we have plain language policies that are suitable for yachts, passenger vessels, fishing vessels, and inland craft, for example. And these have been extremely popular with our members. And it's for this reason that we've chosen this format to base our autonomous vehicle policy on. Now, autonomous vehicles, why do they suit this plain language wording? Well, I think a couple of reasons. The language is suited to the unique, can be suited to the unique requirements of the vessel types. Also, the way that we word the policies is they're short and they're simple and easy to understand. That's the kind of the point of the plain language. And we have a set of FAQs that illustrates how the cover works. And key really to all of that is that for us is that we're giving the same wide cover as the club rules and the same quality of service as you would naturally expect with the club. But I think the plain language policy is roughly 4 pages versus 149 pages, so that's a plus in terms of wading your way through it. So what type of cover are we giving with our autonomous vehicle policy? Well, we're providing, in summary, marine liability claims for surface vehicles spanning the various levels of Lloyd's Register control, predominantly the smaller, up to 24 metres predominantly, but please speak to us about anything around about or slightly bigger than that, as well as subsurface autonomous vehicles, both of these being areas where we've seen exciting new opportunities. This is an all-risk policy, so all the risks are covered other than the ones that we tell you are not in the exclusions. So again, it's they're fairly simple. So our approach to cover, I just thought I'd just talk a little bit here about how we came about discussing and developing, I suppose, our policy. Well, the way that we approached the task was really very much collaborative, and we got together all the various functions of the club, that is underwriting, claims, loss prevention and legal, and just really brainstormed the risks around where we saw the risks were, and working also a little bit with the industry to try to develop a suitable policy. And as a team, we saw we tried to think what would the needs be and how could the policy best respond. So in terms of the similarities and differences between traditional and autonomous vessels or vehicles, so at Shipowners, of course, we're familiar with traditional vessels in the sectors that many of these autonomous vehicles will work on, and which has been already discussed today, of course, such as oil and gas, geophysical survey, offshore renewables. So when we looked at drafting our policy, we thought, well, what's different about those autonomous vehicles working in these sectors, and how will we deal with that in our wordings? So, as I've already said, our language is short and simple, but as Paul Dean mentioned earlier, of course, all marine insurance is based on established international conventions and a regulatory framework, and we simply can't do away with all of that history. And so in our language, you will see references to some of the very usual references, such as to Hague and Hague-Visby rules for cargo. And I think the key is here where applicable. So where they're not applicable, it won't be applicable. Where it does apply, it will apply. In other areas, of course, we've been able to angle the policy, particularly for autonomous vehicles, referencing, of course, the code, which now we have the full benefit of, and which, of course, James has spoken very eloquently about earlier. Now, as Paul Dean highlighted earlier today, of course, international conventions were not designed with autonomous vehicles in mind. But I think the key here is a mutual club that I'd really like to sort of bring out today, is that we see the role as to supporting our members, and we take our members' liabilities as we find them. That's the way that we always work. And so for autonomous vehicles, I think we can take exactly the same usual approach on claims, which is to stand with our members and to establish whatever defences we believe are available, whether that be under Hague-Visby or collision regulations or perhaps tonnage limitation, whatever the defences may be. So there could be uncertainty, of course there could be, as to whether some of these vehicles can fit in with some of the existing legislation. But there won't be any doubt about our loyalty with the owners and operators in establishing for their benefit and for our benefit the outcome on those claims. And I think also, importantly, for the future liability landscape, looking to really make sure that we're developing that in a positive manner. And of course, we look to pay claims. We're a mutual club, an IG club, and that's what we're known for. As Paul mentioned earlier, the members own the club, and we look to pay their claims, always with that in mind. Just before moving on, and this ties in a little bit with the points I've already made, we've really taken a positive approach with the cover and given that cover as widely as we could within sensible parameters. So we want to give comfort to the sector here. There's going to be a lot of areas, as we've already heard lots about today, that new operators are going to have to think about. And I don't think the insurance is going to be they're going to want insurance to be on that list in terms of a concern. So we've tried to give it as widely, or we have given it as widely as we can. Of course, we've not thought of everything within this policy, and we see the policy as being revised as the industry and regulation moves forwards. And what James mentioned on the code strikes me a bit here. The code will be revised, so will the policy be revised as the IMO scoping exercise progresses. Of course, as things move on, this policy will need to be revised. I imagine it annually. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to provide a small insight into our thinking on two kind of key issues that we thought about when we drafted the policy. I could choose quite a few topics because we had a lot of interesting conversation actually. But I'm going to focus on crew risks and cyber risks. People risks. Now, it's been really interesting for us to focus, and important, I think, on what we saw as the fundamental difference in what crew now can mean for some autonomous vehicle types. So, as set out in the industry code, I'm going to just quote here, crew is a person employed or engaged in any capacity on board a ship, on the business of the ship, or any person engaged in the direct control and operation of the ship from a remote location. Now, obviously this remote location has been mentioned already quite a bit today, but of course that is a fundamental departure from our traditional understanding of crew, which historically, of course, is always considered to be on board the vessel. Just developing that thought a little bit, I'd like to just bring out a little bit here, and again this has been mentioned, the difference I suppose particularly in a P&I context between P&I cover to and of the crew. Starting with of the crew, when we talk in P&I terms of the crew, we're thinking really about errors, human errors such as navigational errors leading to P&I claims. As Paul has already mentioned, the club covers liabilities typically such as damage to property, collision or pollution caused by such crew errors. Now, whilst the crew will be located remotely, it is our view from a P&I perspective that so long as the crew is controlling or operating the vessel and the incident is clearly attributable to that crew negligence, then the club cover remains in place and the P&I policy will absolutely respond. Now, liabilities to the crew, illnesses and injuries, what I'm now talking about, and these figures I've mentioned already today, so I won't sort of repeat that too often, but of course, a lot of claims notified to the club, just over 30%, are illness and injury claims, and they account for, I think, 20% of total claims by way of quantum. So that's interesting, of course, for us, a big frequency of claims, as I say, has been mentioned, and by Paul in particular. So we hope to see those claims reduce. But what was really interesting in our conversation, I think, was to just thinking about, can we actually continue to cover liabilities to crew in the same way? This was something that came up in the panel discussion earlier, actually, it was interesting to see how that conversation developed. Our crew in the same way now. Some crew may seldom, if ever, board the vessel. They're unlikely to be signed on in the usual way or working under a standard industry crew contract. The more we thought about it, we felt that those types of crew became perhaps a bit more akin to employees. So we think perhaps now in the future, whereas a typical crew claim may have been man slips over an engine room, now it may be crew spills coffee on herself at remote control station ashore. And we thought, that doesn't feel very P&I at first. Does that matter for club cover? So we've thought about that a lot, and we do feel confident that so long as that crew is operating and controlling the vessel, that will come within P&I cover to the crew. However, interestingly, of course, that'll be just sort of a change of mindset, I suppose, for underwriters and claims for the club now going forwards, in terms of bearing in mind that perhaps some of these incidents may be more employee type, and this is almost like a new category versus the traditional signed-on crew. Cyber. So how could cyber risks lead to a P&I claim? So first of all, I just want to say there's obviously a lot of focus on autonomous vessels from a cyber risk perspective. I thought it was really interesting to hear Dan's view that actually perhaps risk to autonomous systems could be less than manned, with humans potentially being the weak link. And as Dan said, I'm sure that could lead to quite a lot of interesting conversation there. From a P&I point of view, of course, cyber attacks do concern us. So autonomous systems being compromised could naturally affect vessel safe navigation and could lead to all manner of incidents that would fall within the club cover, collision, property damage, and some of the types of claims that have already been mentioned. So that's something, of course, that's going to be more and more of a focus for us going forwards in terms of analysing, as an insurer, the cybersecurity aspects. But I'd like to, because there's a lot of focus, I think, on cyber and concern about what's covered, those who insure with us can rest assured that our policy doesn't provide any exclusion for cyber-related incidents. So therefore, a sort of a malicious cyber attack, the sort that perhaps Dan mentioned earlier, perhaps a financial gain or simply a systems breakdown leading to a P&I event, we would see those as falling within the club cover, and we wouldn't have any concern on that front. Now, there are niche claim situations that could trigger an exclusion, and they would be cyber attacks carried out by a terrorist or a state-sponsored attack. Now, never say never, touch wood, but in our living memory, certainly at the club, I think I'm speaking for everyone at the club here anyway, we've encountered very few claims with war and terror aspects, and certainly none so far with a cyber element, but I should mention that we do have niche exclusions there. So in any event, happy to confirm that it's an all risks policy. We don't have an exclusion for cyber. So to conclude, our policy is available, as Britt said. It's our soft launch of our P&I policy, so I'm really happy to announce that. We really very much want to partner with potential members and grow with you and speak to you about what we can do for you, so we'd be delighted to hear from you. And any questions, I'm happy to take those on the panel.